Hello, I'm Martha Glennie, jewelry professor at George Brown College in Toronto. My videos look at different jewelry forms, items. I'm offering tips, tools, and suggestions that work for me. I want to talk about polishing flaws today. Well, it is unfortunate, but along with polishing comes polishing flaws. There's a number of them that are fairly common. I want to run through those, describe them to you, and give you some clues about how to prevent them and how to fix them. So the first one we're going to look at right here are wheel buff lines. So if we can imagine that this is a disc of metal, and you'll see when you hold the piece in light and in reflection, you'll see a series of short little lines. They're actually depressions in the surface. And they are actually caused by when you're starting off with a new buff and you don't put enough compound on it. And by not putting enough compound on it, it actually is the fabric that's coming around, and the little ends of the fabric are whipping down onto the surface. And when they do that, they leave a mark. So this is something only comes up when you're having a new wheel buff and you're breaking it in. And to prevent it, you want to just make sure that you've got the right amount of compound on it, that it's covering up those little fabric whips so you don't get these kind of lines. If you do find you're getting these kind of lines, you may need to go back to sanding, the last sanding that you did, and then start coming forward again, making sure there's enough compound on your wheel buff. The next one we're going to look at is related in a way, but the lines have a different character. And these are polished sanding lines. So this is related to the previous one because it also is caused by not enough compound on your wheel. And what happens is, instead of cutting through the sanding lines just get burnished. So the piece can look very shiny, but what you're going to see are long parallel lines that are consistent in the direction that you last sanded in. So I think we can guess what the prevention for this is, and that is make sure you've got enough compound on your wheel, make sure that you're pressing hard enough on your wheel, and make sure you've sanded each step thoroughly. Because it could be that, perhaps, let's say for instance, you stop sanding at 400, okay? And that looks good, but hiding underneath are some 350, 320 lines. And when you come to the polishing, you take off all the 400 lines, but whoops, those deeper lines are hiding there. So each step thoroughly, press maybe a little bit harder, and have enough compound on. Let's see what our next one is. Oh, lap lines. So we're doing all the lines all together. And I wanted to talk about lap lines because we want to distinguish them from sanding lines. Sanding lines are always going to be straight and parallel, but lap lines are going to be parallel curved lines, okay? And they come from, obviously, using the felt laps. And we looked at felt laps in another video about polishing flat surfaces. So if you go from the Tripoli lap or Gray Star lap or whatever compound you're using and move forward to polishing, but with a wheel buff or say with the Rouge lap, but you're doing an insufficient job at that point, what you're going to be left with are these curved lines. Or perhaps you're new to the lap and you're busy lapping and your surface is covered by these curved lines and you keep lapping and you say, I can't get rid of them. Well, you shouldn't get rid of them because these are the lines that are replacing the sanding lines. So just so you can recognize them, from a lap, they're going to be curved, and from sanding, they're going to be straight. Now, what's our next surprise? Oh, this is the one that students and professionals have to deal with. Drag lines are a very common flaw that comes up. And really, what the trick is, for any of these flaws, but especially for drag lines, that you must keep your eye out for them. Because if you can catch them quickly, you can polish them away. So how do you know it's a drag line as opposed to some other kind of a flaw? Well, sometimes drag lines are called comet tails. Can you guess why? Look, don't these look like there's a little dot and then a tail? A little dot and a tail. And sometimes they're a little bit longer and sometimes they're a little bit shorter. They tend to come in patches. If you're avoiding the edge because you don't want to over polish it, you may find you have drag lines on that edge. And what they come from is polishing too much in the same direction. You're not changing the orientation of the object to the wheel enough. So, for instance, say there's a little pit right there, and I polish and I polish and I polish and I don't change the orientation. Well, that little pit is going to get dragged up onto the surface and create an indentation. They're very slight, but if you keep going, they're going to get deeper. So, how do we get rid of them when we spot them, when they're just new and not very deep? Well, we're going to polish across it. Okay? We're going to put some effort, maybe add a little compound to your wheel and polish across those, and you can get rid of them. If you've kept going and they're quite deep, well, you have to go back a step and perhaps sand it, create a new, nice, smooth, flat surface, and come back to polishing again. Now, there's another type of drag line, and that's what this little shape right here we're representing. So this is a pierced area in our metal. And you're bringing the rest of the metal up to a mirror finish. And you're using a wheel buff. And what happens is that the wheel buff falls into the hole and then comes out of the hole. So if I'm consistently polishing this way with the wheel, so the wheel's coming around and the buff is falling into the hole and then coming up onto the surface, it actually will drag a depression up onto the surface. And they often are kind of deep and hard to get rid of. You definitely have to go back to sanding. So when you have pierced areas, the rule is you, as much as you can, you polish into the hole. And you polish into the hole, but never coming out of the hole. So that's a pretty simple theory. Sometimes it's harder to do in practice, depending on what your pierced area is. So another piece of advice I have for you is when you have pierced areas, use the hard laps more than the wheel buffs. And in fact, if you can go through the whole process, polishing laps into rouge laps, that's even better. So because drag lines come up fairly frequently, you want to get to be good at getting rid of them. Now, what else have we got on offer here? Okay, orange peel. Now, orange peel is related to drag lines, but it most often comes up in the buffing process rather than the polishing process. And it will look like clusters of little dots, or you could have it over the whole surface. In fact, they're little mini drag lines. And what they're coming from is perhaps insufficient compound on your wheel buff, insufficient pressure when you're putting the object on the wheel buff. Or it could be, and this is especially true with flat surfaces, like this is representing, your buff is hitting all around the outside, but it's not hitting so well in the center. So again, a good solution for flat pieces is using laps. A good solution for curved or shaped pieces is just get in there a little more aggressively, a little more compound, a little more pressure. Okay, so this is a buffing flaw. Now, what's up? Oh, cloudy patches. This is another buffing flaw. And when your work is washed and it's all ready, you think you're done, and you tip it in the light a little bit, well, you see these cloudy patches. What you probably won't remember is that those cloudy patches are exactly underneath where compound rouge was stuck to the work. Now, it does happen, certainly much more with rouge than it does with polishing compounds, that it can build up and stick onto the metal. One of the causes is if you're using a very large, like a 5 or 6 inch wheel, that's going very quickly and it gets very hot, builds up a lot of friction, and so the compound sort of adheres to the metal. Another thing that happens is if you aren't pressing hard enough. So if this is happening to you and you're using a big wheel, go to a smaller wheel. Maybe try a harder rouge wheel and try pressing a little harder. What happens is that under where it builds up, when you wash it, there's these cloudy areas. So you've built up compound and then you keep polishing over top of it, and this is the result. But this one has a pretty easy fix. Just go back to the buff. They will easily buff off. All right? If you're having trouble with the compound consistently sticking, I would say probably you're not pressing hard enough. All right? But this is one of the easier ones to fix, so don't worry. Now I've got 2 more here. Oh, they're getting worse as we go along. Grooves. Now I've drawn, you can see there's little grooves in the surface. Here I've drawn a cross section. Now I've exaggerated this, and I've exaggerated it so you make sure you understand what I'm talking about. But we can develop depressions through the polishing process particularly. And these depressions are going to run across the metal this way. And they can come from a couple things. For new polishers, it often will be that, say I've got my little piece and I'm holding it here, and I'm using a wheel buff, and I'm holding it, and I polish it, and I polish it, and I polish it, and I don't change my orientation. Well, what happens is that the wheel buff actually wears a pattern in, and it wears grooves into the piece. Okay? So that's an easy fix, right? We just have to remember every time you take it to the wheel buff, you change the orientation. And what I'd like to say, I see new students doing this particularly, is that they go like this, and then they go like this. And they say to me, well, I did change the orientation. Well, you're not really. You're just repeating the same movements over. And what you're wanting to do is change it every time in all directions, okay? So that's an easy one to fix. The other way we get grooves is when we're using the lap. And we're not sliding the piece onto the lap properly. And say we've got the edge of the lap, and when we put our piece on, we don't put it on parallel like this. We put it on at an angle. And then whoops, that edge of the lap digs into our metal. So that's a matter of being just so careful when you slide your piece onto the lap, and it should be parallel to the lap. Now, how do we prevent that? Well, yes, we've talked about how we prevent it in the 2 cases. If we get grooves, what do we do? Well, unfortunately, you have to go back to sanding, because often these are quite they have a depth to them. And if you keep polishing, they'll only get more rounded. It's like the difference between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, which are soft and rounded through wear. These will just get more soft and rounded. So what you actually have to do is go back to sanding and take the whole level down to the lowest point. So this isn't something we want to be dealing with, particularly in gold. That wasting a lot of metal. So grooves, and I have one more for you here. Whoops, and now what do we got? We've got a picture of an orange, for goodness sakes. Well, this can also be called orange peel, but really what's happening is it's an overworked surface. And it begins to resemble the kind of mottled surface that an orange has. And it really does come from overworking the metal, polishing it for too long, buffing it for too long. And the thing that you do to, if you get it, is you need to go back. So you maybe need to go back to your last sanding. You maybe need to go back to your previous lap. And what you have to do is cut that top surface off and make a whole new smooth surface to come forward again. My very best advice for any kind of polishing situation or flaws is, and this version of orange peel is, don't spend more time than you have to. Do the minimum. Take it to where it's a good finish and stop. Don't think that if you keep working it, it will become better. Because many of these flaws we've talked about are coming up when people overwork their surface. So, I hope that's helpful in thinking about how to prevent these polishing flaws, in thinking about avoiding them, in thinking about repairing the surface. All right? So, go off there and polish beautifully. First time, quick, quick, like a bunny.